Good morning and welcome to the new edition of Dr. Lamba's Awakening Call. China, India, China, South Sea, China, Philippines, China, Vietnam, China, USA. The words resound as if China is a bugbear and each country, each neighbor feels threatened. Is it so? Yes, it is. But it may not necessarily be so. Let's concentrate today only on Indo-China issue. I talked in the morning with an article about the role of Russia. Earlier also we have seen that Russian bear is not going to challenge the dragon in favor of Indian elephant. But then, what are the options for India and why is it that in the last 70 years the policy of India vis-a-vis China has not altered appreciably? We have failed to acknowledge the rise of China and the scale it presents. Until we appreciate that, we will not be able to craft a proper policy. And what is needed is a dovetailed policy, political, cultural, social, economic, and military. There are various aspects of this policy, and we need to craft it. But first, we have to recognize the one fact that Z is in the tradition of imperialist powers, whether they were Russia, whether they was USA, whether it was Great Britain, France, Portugal, or Mesopotamia. All these imperial powers wanted to extend their kingdoms. China is no exception. It has the vision of grandeur of Manchu dynasty. It has visions of Kublai Khan, who had, and Halaku of course, who had created an image in the world of being a big imperial power. And like the powers before it, it wants to redeem its territorial claims, has ambition to curb the neighbors, to reshape a global order, to suit its interest. And that's what all the imperial powers do. They shade, they shade, the form may change, but the content remains the same. And the content is that President Z represents the tradition of the imperial power that was once of China and has been of the earlier other imperial powers as well. The brutal episode recently in Galwan Valley hopefully will confront and compel Delhi to confront the enduring tragedy of the policy, which is no policy. Whether it was at the time of Nehru or Rajiv or Atal or Narasimha or Modi, the policy has not changed. You see, cosmetic changes, the use of the different words, does not mean altering the. It is only increasing the speed. You had the coal burning trains, you put the diesel ones and the electric ones. But the technological change that was required has not been there. India's China policy, to be recrafted, has to be understood in its historical context. And the people who ignore history suffer. We should never forget that. Ignoring history, and we have been ignoring history in all aspects, whether it was Pakistan or whether it's China. Now, our Indo-China policy is rooted in the persistent political fences. We have refused to learn from the past mistakes, and we have always thought that USA and the West are the source of India's problem with China. It's not. This is not about blaming one party or the other that has ruled India in the last 7 decades. No. Apportioning blames is not going to be useful because each one of them is guilty of acts of omission or commission. And this problem did not start with Nehru. Let's be very clear. It predates independence. Such in each generation has only done one thing. It has compounded the challenge with reluctance to discard the illusions that India's China policy has been nurtured over the last century. Let's start with Rabindranath Tagore. I don't want to go to the hoary past. A few songs of Faya who visited India. And their visits to India were not those of travelers. I'm not talking of that hoary past. I'm talking with Rabindranath Tagore. He went to China in 1924 with ambition. And the ambition was developing a shared Asian cultural civilization. Tagore was highly disappointed with the radical groups, including the members of the newly formed Chinese Communist Party, and all of them turned on Tagore for conspiring to divert Chinese attention away from the imperatives of modernization and westernization. While in India we have been clinging to our hoary past, to our traditions, China westernized. And it was not a sort of a cultural slavery, as most of us people in India believe. It was so that they could compete with the West on a level playing field. India has always been saying that we are good in English language and the Chinese cannot talk. Yes. But that was because of that 200 years of slavery to the British Empire. And the command of English language was a must. China didn't have that. But then they started behaving, acting, learning, and they're fast learners. So Tagore's visit was a fiasco, disappointment. Now it was the turn of Jawaharlal, who approached in China as a modernist and a nationalist. He first met Chinese nationalists in Brussels in 1927. But when the Second World War broke out, and a decade later, Chinese were unwilling to join hands with India, or India was unwilling to join hands with China in defeating Japanese imperialism. And the Chinese felt it, that India talks big of freedom, but here the Japanese have attacked them, and their Congress is not supporting China. So this difference in the approach, in the talk and the policy disgruntled them, and they took a vow, we'll teach this country a lesson. Emperor Xi is following that. So India has been indulging in rhetoric of anti-imperialism, but they never supported the different imperial powers. If India did not support China, don't forget, China participated in the Second World War with USA and England, and India at that time in the form of Congress opposed it. India participated because it was under the rule of the British, but the leadership was against it. Now comes independence. Jawaharlal Nehru becomes the prime minister. He reaches out the communist rules of China, campaign against the Western attempts to isolate them, serenaded Chou Enlai at Afro-Asian Conference in Bandung in 19 55. And within 5 years, from 55, India and China were getting acrimonious relationship, enmity. And the war broke out in 1962. Later on, Atal Bihari Vajpayee traveled to China in February 1979 to re-engage. But before he could even reach home, China-Vietnam War started. Now, here's a very dicey, or rather I say perplexing situation. Atal goes to Pakistan in a bus as a friendship and Kargil is attacked. Atal goes to China and before he comes back, China attacks Vietnam. This shows how much disregard they had. So much for the Asian solidarity. Rajiv earlier in 1988 had sought to normalize relations with China while continuing to negotiate on the border dispute. And that defined a template started by Nehru, Tagore, and that was neither normalizing the relationship nor resolving the boundary dispute. None of them had the vision to sit down and take a decision, maybe against a popular vision, popular need. But then some decision should have been taken. To make matter worse, the other issues have taken a life of their own. For example, the massive annual trade deficit. If India thought economic cooperation will improve mutual trust and create conditions for resolving political differences with China, it was mistaken. It failed again. And it had to fail because China was not interested in having a parity. It has been a root shock. India's massive trade deficit with China is a little over half its total deficit globally. Worse, India is finding it hard to disentangle from the economic dependence on imports. All this talk of boycott Chinese and everything is not happening. And Natkani was very correct when he said that when you import things, you have already paid. Things are at the port. So who is going to suffer? The Indian importer, not the exporter. They've already got the money. Now, as a Cold War, came to a close, India bet that the political cooperation with China on a global issue will be a base for bilateral relationship. And as usual, it was wrong. PV Narasimha Rao and his successors joined China and Russia in promoting a multipolar world. And the code for that war purpose was to limit US power after Washington came out victorious in the Cold War and facilitate the breakup of Soviet Union. And nearly a quarter of a century embarking on the strategy to blunt America's unipolar movement, India is now struggling to cope with the emergence of a unipolar Asia. By this Quad, cooperation with Japan, cooperation with South Korea, Australia. But they ignore the fact that Beijing is the dominant center of Asian politics. ASEAN without China is Hamlet without the Prince of Denmark. So China's rapid rise has paved the way for potential emergence of a bipolar world. And those poles are Washington on one side, Beijing on the other. So this brings us to the perennial illusion in India. In Delhi, the politicians are deluded about Asian and anti-Western solidarity with China. Despite the failures of the repeated efforts to construct such unity with China in interwar period, the decade after independence, the Cold War period, the years after Cold War, Indian elite in politics and bureaucracy persisted with this myth. I remember talking to Natwar Singh once, and I told Natwar that you are committing suicide by following this policy. But as usual, the bureaucrat and politician were swayed by the political opinion of the leader. So, linking to this undying claim that US is seeking to divide India, it was, and China. But for the evil imperial the fantasy goes, Delhi and Beijing would be enjoying everlasting peace. The fact is, India doesn't need America to divide India and China. Our respective territorial nationalism and irreconcilable conflict do the job sufficiently well. Another problem is that we have always been taken in by the decision dilemma that is posed by China. China is very cunning. Let's not forget that. Very shrewd. So they pose a dilemma. On the one side, there is a soft acceptance of BPM, CBM, agreeing to disengage, and then again revert back to status quo. So very friendly, very good. Yes, we are. We'll withdraw, then we'll negotiate. You withdraw, and they don't withdraw. Or they withdraw one step, come back 100 steps. Whether you call it Islami or not, but then that's their attitude. They continue to maintain a sizable force in depth, and the purpose is to demonstrate the effect. China does not want a war, let's be very clear, but it is definitely like a rat nibbling at your borders. It wants to claim territory that can be exploited in future. Imagine if it takes Galwan Valley, it's easy for it to control Balistan, Gilgit, Hunza, and then its road, one belt system. Chinese conduct is full of guilt, guile, deceit, treachery. So what are our options? First is that China believes in confrontational tactics and uses historic claims and muscles as tools. We must remember that we cannot neutralize Chinese territorial ambition by chanting peace. We have to acquire power and stand up to the bully. And I'm happy that Prime Minister Modi is doing that. And by the end of the month, possibly, Rafales would be coming to reinforce the Air Force. The massing of the Indian Army on the borders, 3,000 odd kilometer border, is not a mean achievement. Whatever the opposition might say, credit goes to Modi that he has not been lulled by the false promises of China. 20 people dying is a big thing, but it's not that big a thing as other nations concerned. Now, the other effects too. The British imperialists, for example, wanted China and India to unite against Japanese imperialists in the Second World War. Chiang Kai-shek visited India at the instance of the Britishers. He met Gandhi. Gandhi met Chiang Kai-shek but refused to cooperate. So Congress opted out of war. British India, Great Britain, and USA went to support Chinese aggression. So Chinese never really bought into the Indian idea of building a collision against the West. So why are we doing that? While India never stopped arguing with the West, Chinese developed a sustained engagement with USA, Europe, Japan. They professed to be communist, but they broke with communist Russia to join forces with the USA in early 70s, less than 2 decades after they had fought American forces in the Korean War. Deng at that time promoted economic development and cooperation with USA to transform China. India did not take step at that time. Deng was very, very far-sighted that way. If I think Modi had been the prime minister at that time with his vision, he might have done much better. Or even if Narasimha Rao had been the prime minister at that time, that duo, Narasimha Rao Manmohan Singh, could have done much better. So the Chinese leveraged a deep relationship with the West, and the purpose was that it elevated itself in the international system. Today, the whole Europe looks to China, not to India. And then India might say itself in that, well, we are Visha Gurus. We might be gurus, but gurus are never feared. Let me forget. So India Delhi continues to think that staying away from America is the answer to have good relations with Beijing. No. Build your relationships, even with America. Why should we be afraid of asking help from Trump? Come, send us your Navy SEALs who can take out the terrorists either in Pakistan or the enemies in that. Why should we hesitate in using Israel? So we have misread consistently Chinese interest and ambitions. And the longer India takes to change their strategic lassitude, laziness, the greater would be the Chinese trouble. India needs to realize that China is a gigantic power, must recognize that it is a power which wants to redeem its territorial ambition and an ambition to show India that India is not as great as China is. China is committed to reshape the global interest, global order to suit its interest. And it has not hidden these goals. India has to accept that they are ahead and then we will beat them. When you recognize your opponent's worth, you develop strategies to outsmart them. So recognizing the challenge it presents is the first step India has to take. For Modi government, this should be a valuable opportunity to go back to the basics. We need internal political coherence. The discordant noise by Congress and Congress alone is a problem, but then that should not be the stumbling block. We need to craft an organic, living, and ever changing policy. The policy should be modulated A, B, C. If A doesn't happen, this is B. And if A happens, then B plus would be there. So this new policy is required. Negate all your past. Cut off the links to the past. Start de novo. That way lies salvation and the establishment of India as a leader in the new world order that's likely to emerge. Let's see what the government does. Thank you.